Tell you what.
Nate, where were you just now? I saw in your story were you at a concert, or was that a video that you uploaded?
No, I was at work today. Cutting hair.
Maybe it was something you just shared. I saw someone climbing over a fence.
Oh yeah, that must have just been like something on Instagram.
I thought for some reason it didn't look like a shared post. I was like, that looks fun.
All right. Well, episode 102, Lucas. We're here after a little bit of a break, and it's kind of feeling weird. I'm not gonna lie to you.
Yeah. No, I agree, and I'm still on the coming back from Europe, like just equilibrium is still not there. Like it just I'm settling in with the time here, and
you come back a changed man.
You know, a Taylor Swift concert will do that to you.
You're a Swiftie for life.
It was a phenomenal show, man. But obviously Paramore opening up was probably the highlight for me.
All right. Well, getting into today's episode will be fun. But before we do that, I just want to thank our Discord family. Follow us over on Patreon if you want to become part of the Discord. We give you early access. We do meetings every couple weeks and just little extras here and there. But make sure you like, comment, and subscribe on this episode. Let us know what you want to see in the future. And yeah, Lucas, you want to talk about what we're talking about?
Yeah, so this is, since we started the species spotlight segment, this is the longest that we've gone without doing one. I think it's been over 2 months. And I'm really happy to jump back in with doing Drymarchon. We have Black Pearl Reptiles, John Michels on, and it's going to be I think a great show. I don't know about you, but when we go over to Phil Thompson's place, it's one of my favorite animals to hold. He has an indigo there. And the species in general, to me, it's like, you know, I've always heard and interacting with them and seen how they think. It's kind of like the closest intelligence wise. Yeah.
I think I know where you're going with this too.
I just think they're the closest thing that you're going to get to a cobra, to a king cobra. They're just, they think and they look into your soul. They're
little dragons, and they're super cool. I think of Richard Bilbo's indigo that he brings to shows, and
that thing's majestic.
Oh yeah,
it's huge.
It's a giant male, red-throated Eastern, and just the most docile, awesome animal to show off.
Yeah, I did a lot of research. I actually, it's funny, when I sent John the link today through my Gmail, he auto-populated, and I remembered I reached out to him probably four years ago, asked some questions, and I went through my rabbit hole researching on them, but I'm excited to finally talk to the guy when it comes to Drymarchon and having him on, and really just get from his mouth all about these animals.
All right. Well, without further ado, you want to welcome in Lucas?
Yeah. John, what's going on? Whether you've poured your heart and soul into your reptile business or you've just begun your business journey, AE Foundry has you covered with next level expertise in graphic design, motion graphics, videography, photography, and so much more. If you've been dying for a new logo for your reptile business, motion graphics for your current logo, a new website, or need assistance making your video podcast come to life, then listen carefully. AE Foundry's mission places storytelling at its core. AE Foundry believes that a distinctive story and background are the driving forces that set your brand apart. In today's market, consumers seek more than just products. They crave a connection built on trust with the brands they cherish. AE Foundry is committed to empowering small businesses and fostering authenticity that resonates with their consumers. Reach out to them and let them help you craft a visual narrative that helps establish a genuine and lasting connection with your audience. To contact AE Foundry, email them at aromero@aefoundry.com or on Instagram at AEFoundry. When it comes to housing your retics, trust me, you're going to want an enclosure that will be just as strong and durable as your reticulated python. The Heartland Reptile Enclosure is next level tough and will outlive you and your retic by several generations. Heartland Reptile Enclosures are designed and manufactured out of powder-coated aluminum to provide the highest quality and longevity available in the reptile enclosure. What makes them even better is they are lighter than your PVC and plastic enclosures out there and are extremely tough. Stop playing around with plastic enclosures for your large constrictors and step up your enclosure game with the Heartland Reptile Enclosure. To inquire about one of these enclosures, speak to Jordan himself at Heartland Reptiles on Instagram, Facebook, and on TikTok. Here on TRL, we preach about the importance of using hooks, feeding tongs, and other tools with your reticulated python all the time. Animal Equipment by Stoney not only has all the tools you need for any snake you keep, but they have the absolute best hooks on the market. What sets Animal Equipment by Stoney's hooks apart from the other guys is their polycarbonate hook ends that provide a warm feel that won't disturb or bother your retic, ensuring a positive interaction from the get-go. Since 2008, AE Stoney has been supplying zoos, herpetologists, and other animal professionals with their tools. It's time for you to step your hook game up and buy an AE Stoney hook. To learn more and purchase one of their amazing products, visit aestoney.com.
Hey guys, thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. Let me ask you, I said John Michels. Is it Michels or Michels?
It's Michels, yeah.
Michael. Okay, just wanted to make sure. All right, man. I'm excited to jump into this. You I'm pretty sure you keep every species of Drymarchon out there and breed them and have a phenomenal website, which you don't see often, today with reptile breeders. So, before we even jump into the Drymarchon species and everything, if you don't mind, we're definitely a retic oriented podcast. There's people that are probably interested and don't know too much about you. Do you mind just kind of telling us a little bit about who you are, your journey with reptiles, and how you landed onto the species that we're talking about today?
Yeah, not a problem. I don't know that my start with reptiles was too much different than a lot of people. I mean, it sort of started with like a childhood obsession, I had older brothers and we'd go, hiking and fishing and camping and whatever else. And, hey, there's a snake, grab it, So it kind of started with like a field aspect. And so I was just sort of into like catching snakes whenever I could, as a kid. And, I was fascinated with them. And, while my parents were supportive, my dad was like, hey, listen, you're not going to spend any money on one, So, but if you want to, keep something, sure. So I, being in Southern California, I'd go out and catch gopher snakes or whatever. And bring them home, and just, keep them and feed them mice. And I just thought it was super cool. So the whole aspect of like, keeping and breeding didn't come until a little bit later. It's kind of started with a field thing. But the field stuff sort of started it. So what I got into in the high school era was, I'd bring home a handful of gopher snakes and I just throw them all in one cage, not
Awesome.
the ones for husbandry, and the males would combat and, they'd breed and I'd get a clutch or two of eggs and that's cool. So then I, figured out how to incubate them and then I just released the babies and the adults back where I caught them and all that sort of thing. And I just thought it was fun, and it wasn't until, closer to the college era, a little after college or whatever else that I thought, hey, there's like a lot of really neat things out there that I can keep that are not, found locally in Southern California, So I thought, hey, it'd be cool to kind of just, buy stuff and keep stuff. And, I did have a couple, pythons here and there for you python people. What
did you keep?
Oh man, I think I had a big Burmese at one point, and it was mostly just to kind of have in my college apartment just to freak people out when they come over, feed it rabbits.
Wait, you had that at BYU?
Yeah, well, listen, I did a lot of things I wasn't supposed to do with the lab.
I was like,
But
that's really questionable on that campus.
yeah, well, I was in off-campus housing, and it was, I wasn't super honest about where I was living because you're supposed to live in certain areas. But anyway, just stuff like that. But anyhow, but I had a friend who was breeding Alterna, gray banded kings, and I thought that's pretty cool. And you mean you can actually sell these for money and people actually want to buy it? That's pretty neat. And so, I kind of thought, all right, well, let me get into something that I can breed and, produce some eggs, and maybe I could even sell them to help me pay for the mice, whatever else. It was not like a business or anything. It was just I wanted to fool around. And so I wanted something that was small, interesting where I landed eventually, but smaller and manageable. But also didn't want the pain of like getting gray banded king snakes eating when they're babies, So I started out with Honduran milk snakes. And so
Cool.
I buddied up with the late Shannon Brown, who kind of mentored me through some of that stuff. And then, I kind of got to play around with some of the morphs and things. And so I started breeding those and, sold some of the babies, and then it was, it could pay for the mice. And then it was, hey, I got a couple $100 extra. What am I going to spend this on? And eventually there was a guy that was living near me that had a pair of adult black-tailed Cribos that he was selling. And I saw him, and that the face and the face markings and the contrast between the top part of the body and that jet black tail, I was just super fascinated with. I didn't know much about keeping them or whatever else, but I bought them with my extra milk snake money. And next thing I knew, I had a clutch of eggs, and like, well, and then people are beating down my door to buy them, and I thought, well, this is pretty dang cool. And then it was, man, I guess I better figure out how to get these things feeding and all that. But it worked, and it just was a lot of learning on the fly kind of a thing. And so, and every snake that I sold, I just kept that money and just put it into better caging and kind of elevating, what I could house and what I could do comfortably, and started kind of figuring it out. And once I had the blacktails, it's like, well, then I had to have Easterns, And
Yeah.
so I had an opportunity to buy some Eastern Indigos. And so I bought some of those, and, it just kind of scaled up. And I mean, it sounds fast, but this was sort of a slow process over the course of, a decade where, I kind of built into needing to have all the major subspecies of Drymarchon and being able to produce them. And along the line, I met my business partner, Chris, and he had a similar interest. And so, between having the two of us and having double the space to keep things and double the capital to buy things, and then being able to collaborate with each other on what's working and what's not working and what we can do a better job of, and how we can be more effective in taking care of them and keeping them healthy and keeping them happy, and producing baby snakes that are good, and all that sort of thing. It was just sort of evolved over time. And, that's sort of ended up bringing me to where I am. And, once you kind of have them, I needed to have a big group of all the six major subspecies. So that's where we are. Yeah, I'm sure a lot of people have done this and had a similar journey, just with different species and things.
I'm running that with the locality retic stuff right now. That's kind of, locality has always been my thing, and yeah, and I wanted a big group of the different localities, but now realizing and just having more experience, it's just unrealistic for retics in general to be able to keep that many. I don't know how people do it on a larger scale, but
there's too many localities, right?
If you're trying to keep just the dwarf and super dwarf stuff,
yeah, I mean, even then it's seven, and that's not including ternate.
7 breeding pairs of that many locality retics of really any size. You're right, it's a lot.
Yeah, it's a lot. So I have to get a little more realistic. And but let me ask you, you started off with blacktail Cribos for nostalgic purposes. Is that your favorite? Or do you I mean, I'm curious, and pretty early on before we even jump into behavior differences and things, but I'm curious, what is your favorite to work with out of the group?
Well, I mean, Yeah, and I'm sure we'll dive into the Eastern Indigo shortly here, but the Eastern Indigos sort of they get all the publicity, and rightly so. I mean, they're incredible, and I'm sure we'll get to that. But blacktails absolutely hold a special place for me, and I don't know if I necessarily want to say they're my favorite, but they're absolutely up there, and a lot of it is just the contrast, between that light body and the dark tail and all that, and temperament and all those things too. They're pretty incredible. So yeah, blacktails are up there for me for sure. And a lot of what I tried to do kind of early on when I was doing all this stuff is kind of bring more education and awareness to the types of Drymarchon that are not Eastern Indigos. Like everybody knows Eastern Indigo, I would think, anyhow, but knowing all the others, they're pretty cool. And in a lot of cases, and I know we're going to talk about differences and such, but in a lot of cases, it's essentially the same snake, just a different paint job. They're not too dissimilar. So, trying to bring awareness to some of the other Drymarchons has been a lot of what I've tried to do, and blacktails in particular. And I've seen their popularity go way up over the last couple decades.
I mean, I've seen some of the stuff that's coming out now, and I don't know whether they're imports or people are just selectively breeding and refining, but some of the gold into the jet black tails, like some of the contrast is just insane with some of them. They're honestly, out of the group, probably next to Indigo's my second, as far as just how they look. Yellowtails are also pretty stunning too, but I kind of like the reverse a little bit more.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep.
If you don't mind, so for those of you that are what are Drymarchons? They're colubrids or large colubrids. And if you don't mind, can you just go through the different subspecies of Drymarchon? And while you're going through the different ones, if you don't mind stating just kind of their range of habitat, where they're from.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. Well, there are several, but there are really only 6 major subspecies in the pet trade. So I'll kind of stay focused on those and outline that. The icon of the genus is the Eastern Indigo snake, Drymarchon cooperi, and that's native to the southeastern part of the United States. And they are, they were collected heavily before they were protected. And they were really popular due to, their size and their very calm and docile temperament. For obvious reasons, they make, pretty popular, but, habitat fragmentation, development in their home range and all those things eventually led them to be listed on the Endangered Species Act, rightfully so. And so now their trade in the pet trade is a lot more restricted. But anyhow, so that's kind of the most well known.
It's even restricted some retic laws in Georgia just recently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And then if you travel further west, then we have the Texas indigo, which ranges into the southern part of Texas, which is obviously where they get their name. But that being said, their range is a lot bigger than people think. They go all the way down the eastern coast of Mexico, all the way down to Veracruz. So they actually have a very large range, despite being in a very small part of the United States. So they're pretty similar to Eastern Indigos, a long, big, dark colubrid snake. They'll tend to have a little bit more copper color on the chin and on the face, but very similar to the Eastern Indigo in how you care for them and their body size and shape and all those things.
I'm in San Antonio, and that is my number one Texas species that I want to find. I thought that I was probably 2 hours away from them. And just recently on local page on Facebook, someone took a picture of an a Texas indigo eating another snake, only 45 minutes south from me. So that kind of
you can actually get them in the San Antonio area. Yeah. And there's the population density is way lower up there, but I think it gets thicker in population density the further south you go. But yeah, you're not far away.
Yeah,
think it's
no,
time
I,
for
I
you to
I
get
saw
out
that
there.
I saw that picture yesterday, and I gained a little bit of spark of hope. I was like, okay, so maybe I don't have to travel too far to go find one.
Yeah. Yeah, that's neat. I had an opportunity, not to derail our conversation about all the other subspecies, but I had an opportunity to find some in the field a couple years ago, and I was able to find some. So no, I mean, that's pretty cool to be able to find the animal that you've worked with for decades,
Oh, I
in your
bet.
garage, and then be able to see them in the wild was really neat. But anyhow, so there's the Texas indigo, and then down you're in Mexico, we've got a few different subspecies coming in. So, like I said, the Texas indigo comes in along the northeastern part of Mexico. The northwestern part of Mexico and going down the west coast has what we call the Mexican red tail indigo. Although they don't really have red tails, I don't really know why they got that common name, um, but they're generally down the west coast of Mexico. There's a few different common names for them, but
I like the white
I
that
just call
comes
them
through on
Mexican
them.
indigos. Yeah, so there's what I call sort of the black phase and the white phase. When you're in the wild, there are populations that are more black and white, and others that have more of a red and an orange tinge to them,
I prefer the
depending
orange.
on where
I
you
really
are
like
in the
those.
wild.
Hmm.
Which one?
The orange.
Yeah, those are pretty neat. And so the name that was sort of given to those by hobbyists around the world, I think it's originally started in Europe, was Guerrero, which is a state in
Oh
Mexico
yeah.
where they will end up looking more red and orange. But there are other states around Mexico where they also have that look. So in general, if I were to sort of generalize the localities further north, they'll tend to be a little bit more black and white. And then as you get kind of down the southern part of their range on the West Coast, they can get more of that red color. But again, it's also interesting that they do kind of hook across to the east, and they start getting black and white again. So it's kind of bizarre, but you know, um, I generally just call them red phase and black phase, Mexican indigos along the West Coast there. And so those are cool. And then now we have the blacktail cribo comes up from the south, more along the East Coast. And blacktail cribos they range from Colombia all the way up through Central America and into southeastern Mexico. And they can be variable based on where you find them and all that sort of thing. There are parts of the Yucatan Peninsula where they'll be more red, and so there's a lot of interesting stuff there, and they're pretty popular in the pet trade. And then parts within all that range, particularly in Nicaragua and whatever else, there you have what a subspecies called the unicolor cribo, which is essentially a blacktail cribo without the black tail, or it'll be a little browner. And in the pet trade, there are some that are just kind of uniformly tan and yellow, um, which is where they would get that unicolor name. I have my own personal suspicions on the difference between these two subspecies, the blacktail and the unicolor. To me, they're kind of the same thing, and their ranges do overlap in the wild. So the scientific paper that described the two subspecies is pretty old. I would love to see somebody look at it again. But anyhow, so you have those, and then as you travel even further south now, and you get into South America from Guyana, Suriname, all the way down to almost Argentina, then you're talking about yellowtail cribos. So that yellowtails have a gigantic range. Um, and that rounds it out for the sixth of the major subspecies that are in the U.S. pet trade. And yellowtails are frequently brought in as imports from Guyana and Suriname because those countries are open to exporting wild caught animals, and so you regularly see imported animals coming into the trade there, yellowtails, and then obviously people are breeding them now too, which is pretty cool. So that kind of rounds out all six of the major subspecies. You got the eastern, you got the Texas, you got the Mexican indigo, and then you've got blacktail cribos, unicolor cribos, and yellowtail cribos.
Awesome. I'm curious, out of the six that you're working with, how many of those six did you ever have any of them starting off with wild caught animals?
Well, you can't with easterns.
Yeah, yeah,
not
yeah.
legally. And at the time when I was getting started, you couldn't do it with Texas indigos either. Mexico's closed to exportation as well. So unless there's an animal that made its way across the border illegally, you have that too. So really, the only one that you would have had an opportunity when I was starting out to have start with a wild caught would be yellowtail Cribos. Lately, in the last several years, there's been a handful of blacktails and unicolors coming out of Nicaragua. So there's more opportunity there, but I don't remember a whole lot of that going on when I was getting started out, 15, 20 years ago. It was mostly just yellowtails, and a wild-caught yellowtail can be a bit different than a
Yeah.
captive bred one.
Yeah, and that kind of
I'm
was my
sure you've seen that with
question.
stuff you guys work with.
Yeah, I was, and that's kind of where I was going with this. I wanted to know if you've had any experiences of working with any of them that were wild caught versus how far they've come now. Because I know for the most part, the captive bred ones are pretty good to work with.
Yeah, when you're talking about the yellowtails, it's people are getting better about it, about how to really acclimate a wild caught yellowtail. But a lot of it is, um, they're very aware, they're very alert, they're very intelligent, and so they can stress out pretty easily. So it's keeping them stress free is kind of a big part of it. They'll often come in with various parasites, whether internal or external. So you've got that to contend with. And then they just sort of need to settle and just be stress free for a while. And I've always told people too, it's something you have to be careful about as well. One thing that I've learned with the Drymarchon genus in general is that they drink more water than other snakes. And this is just my own informal observation. And they can dehydrate more quickly than other snakes I've noticed. And, so when you have an animal that's been plucked out of the wild and carried around its native country by whomever grabbed it and then exported it, whatever, who knows how long they've been and in what level of care. And so, you can get an animal that shows up in the United States that might visually look fine. It's not like withered and emaciated. But going without water for a while, not being cared for properly for a while can damage their organs and it can be a bit of a challenge. So wild caught stuff, can absolutely be tough because you don't know what has happened before it came into your care, and you don't know what health problems it's facing, and not all of them are visually perceivable. So
Yeah,
I always
there's
tell people it's better just to go captive bred unless you're up to the challenge of dealing with some of the issues that may arise from a wild caught animal.
Yeah, I mean, and I feel like at this point, with it's starting to gain popularity and more people breeding them, if they're available, to have captive bred,
Right.
it's a no-brainer. And there are a lot of species out there that you get an animal on arrival and it's alive, but essentially it's basically already dead.
Right.
Because of again just going so long without water or other health issues going on. So obviously always a risk with bringing in um, imported animals. So if it's okay, I kind of want to talk a little bit about husbandry with these guys.
Yeah, you said they're pretty similar in terms of like attitude and everything like that. Are there husbandry requirements across all subspecies just as similar?
I take care of all mine the same.
Okay.
For the most part. There's some minute things that I do differently, for breeding cycles, but we can get into that. But generally speaking, this would be true for all of the six major subspecies. They're not, despite a lot of them being, tropical environment snakes, they're not really tolerant of a lot of heat. And the biggest mistake that people will have with these is that if you try to keep it like a python, it's going to die. You know, they don't really do well tolerating temperatures that are much over the mid 80s certainly, and I prefer to keep my stuff more in the high 70s, and that's just all the time. I know some people have success with basking spots, that the snakes will utilize. I don't really do that, but that being said, um, your Drymarchon should be kept in the high 70s, maybe 80, 82. And if it's consistently kept warmer than 82 and it doesn't have an opportunity to cool down, it's not good for your snake, and it can kill your snake pretty quick. So that's really kind of the first and most important thing with husbandry of Drymarchon is temperature. That they're not as tolerant of high temperatures as other types of reptiles are, and that's kind of issue number one that you have to be able to contend with. There are some people that inquire about buying snakes from me, and they in the summertime they don't have a climate controlled room, and their room might be in the upper 80s. So this is not a snake for you. Go buy
Right.
something else. Your snake won't do well in that situation. You're going to kill your snake.
That's a main. So now that we're talking about this out loud, I think that's the reason why I decided to, dip into Pitayus carnata. Because I keep all of my snakes ambient and it's climate controlled, but they're all Indonesian and, that area. And so, my ambient temperatures, I do have natural nighttime drops. I get into outside of breeding season to the 80, but for the most part, my outside of breeding season, it's 80, climbs up to 84, hits 84 during the peak of the day, and then starts to go down back to 80. And I got anxious with knowing that, again, digging into these animals, and I even emailed you a while back. Just it really seems like 78 to 82 is where you want to keep them ambient. And I know that my garage during the summer, will sit 83, 84 for about 4 or 5 hours. And yeah, so I did have an idea of, when I get more space and I move, of keeping them in that ambient garage, but building a larger enclosure for them and actually having like a built-in, just kind of I guess like a cave, like kind of an underground area that would stay maybe 2 degrees cooler than the room, so that if they were cool, they could go into that area. But that's something more elaborate. That's probably way down the road.
We also want to thank VivTech Products for being an affiliate sponsor of the Retic Lounge. Stop by VivTech Products for the best UV spectrum lighting on the market that will enhance and improve your snake's overall well-being and health. Visit vivtechproducts.com and use the code ReticLounge23 today for 15% off. Again, visit vivtechproducts.com and use our affiliate code ReticLounge23 today for 15% off. Looking for the perfect accessories for your hatchlings or juvenile retics? Look no further than Heli Guy Serpents. Our sponsor, Chris Sexton, is coming in hot with an amazing 3D printer, creating top-notch perches and other caging accessories for your beloved pets. Enrich your retics environment with their high-quality products. Use our promo code TRL10 for a 10% discount on your purchase. Visit them today at heliguyserpents.com and start giving your pets the best. Heli Guy Serpents, the premier source for 3D printed caging accessories. Again, that's www.heliguyserpents.com and use our promo code TRL10 for 10% off all of your 3D printed accessories today.
Yeah, and I think your setup is a good example, because that's about the border. I think 83, 84 for a few hours in the afternoon is doable. But if they're 84, 85, 24/7, then you have a problem. If it's going up a little bit in the afternoon, that's cool. But it's when they can't escape that heat and they're exposed to it for extended amounts of time that you start having problems. So
I noticed that with my retics too. So since I don't keep on ambient, I do the gradient. I have a temperature controlled room. I'm in an old place, but I have an AC that controls it to the mid 70s all day, so they at least have that chance to cool off.
Yeah,
right. And there are people that do it differently. I tend to go more ambient, but that being said, I'll ask my buyers, so what's the ambient temperature in your room? And if they say, 72, 74, yeah, you need heat. Put it
right.
put it way off to one side and provide that gradient and set the thermostat on your heat to 82, 83, whatever it is. And you got 73 on one side, you got 83 on the other, you're happy. But if your ambient temp is 78, 80 degrees, you don't need any heat at all. So it's just a question of where you want that pocket and what are you starting off with with your ambient. That's important.
Yeah, and I think that that, now that I switched over to ambient, on gradient before, I kept it in my house that was 72, and sometimes the heat, even the panels that I would buy, didn't work consistently because I was keeping my house cooler, especially during the winter where I'm not really using the heat too much. I'm in Texas, so so making the switch over to ambient was a awesome thing to do. But it's good to hear that even where I'm at, it's not that big of an issue. But I mean, even in pythons, I think what we're starting to learn is that pythons don't need the heat that people have provided them in the 90s and 2000s, even 2010s. And a lot of people are starting to cool down their pythons quite a bit. I mean, retics back in the day, it was like dead set 90-degree hotspot. And now most people are 86, 87. And even incubation temps were 90 degrees. And now people are, I'm incubating my retic eggs at 86.5. So I think people are finally starting to realize that these cold-blooded animals don't need to be kept so hot in general. But yeah, I've heard with the Drymarchon species that it's really like you get into a lot of trouble at a temperature, like you said, 85 consistently, that a python can withstand, and that's okay. But they don't do well.
Right, yeah, no, exactly. And when I made the switch to more of an ambient setup too, I also just feel like it's just a little safer. You don't, you're not quite as worried about a heater and a rack malfunctioning or something like that. Of course, you need whatever you're doing to climate control your room to not malfunction, but I just feel like there's a little bit less opportunity for accidents and things like that too. So I'm happy with it, and the snakes certainly seem happy too. So
Yeah.
I think that's an important part of reptile keeping in general. I don't care if you're keeping pythons or colubrids or whatever it is that there's always something more to learn, and there's
Oh
always a
yeah.
better way to do it. And if we can kind of check our ego a little bit and just be willing to say, hey, look, I have a bunch of experience, but I'm not done learning. There's a lot more that I could do differently, and I try to keep open minded to that. And I see somebody doing something better than me and having some success. It's something we should think about.
Right. Nathan and I talk about that often on here is the people that um that believe they figured it out and are stuck in that way, they stay stagnant while everyone else grows and end up getting just kind of pushed off to the side. You got to be willing to adapt and learn and always observe.
And I feel like we're getting there. And I don't know what it's like in the Python circles, but I feel like in colubrid circles, you know, I feel like in the last 10 years, and whether it's just a smaller world with social media or whatever else, that we're just getting better. We're getting better at what we do, and I think it's sort of that sort of mindset of looking at what other people are doing and collaborating more and trying out different things. If somebody's having success, what works for them might work for you, but it's also willing to be able to admit to say that what works for me might not work for you, and vice versa. But it's that collaborative element, and I feel like the trade in general, we've just gotten a lot better at what we're doing lately, and just having a lot more success. And I feel like I've seen a rise in that in the last decade. It's been pretty cool to see.
Right. Before we dive into other aspects of husbandry, Nathan made a comment as we were jumping into husbandry that reminded me about the behaviors of the 6 different species. And I, being a very observant person, I would hate myself if I didn't go back and ask this. But you said that they're pretty similar for the most part, but then I also heard you say, like with the Eastern indigos, that they're just very known for being like super docile, and so I kind of do want to, even if I have to like poke and pry for you to even if you have to like pick out small differences, but what are some of those differences that you're seeing along the subspecies of Drymarchon in regards to any behavior element that could be feeding, handling, defensiveness, whatever.
Well, let's start with sort of temperament. Yeah, it's absolutely true. Eastern Indigos have a reputation, rightfully so, for being very docile and very handleable, and they are. They absolutely are. And obviously, there's variability within individuals. One thing that you should know, especially if you're moving from sort of the Python world or the constrictor world into Drymarchon, is that they are active and they are flighty. And generally speaking, they're going to move around a lot, and there's variability within individuals, but they can be flying all over the place, even Eastern indigos at times. But what I like about them, and when you hear people use the word intelligent to describe indigo snakes, is that they figure it out really quickly, that hey, you're not here to hurt them. And once they notice that, pretty quickly, they drop that sort of defensiveness and that desire to run or to defend themselves or whatever it may be. And that's when you start getting a really docile snake. So that being said, blacktail Cribos can be super docile, but they're also can start out being very flighty. And it's with that handling and all that sort of thing that they can calm down pretty quickly. I would say if I were to nitpick and kind of, be a generalist or not a generalist, that the yellowtail Cribos can be a little bit more apt to be defensive. But a lot of that is also, you're getting wild-caught ones that are coming in. And of course, they're going to be defensive. It's pretty uncommon to get a wild-caught yellowtail Cribo and have it just be puppy dog tame. It doesn't really happen a whole lot. But that being said, you can absolutely have very calm, captive ones and all that. So when I'm selling my baby snakes, it's just people will ask me, what's their temperament like? I want one that's going to be really tame and whatever else. And I don't care if it's a yellowtail Cribo or an Eastern indigo, they're all kind of the same when they start out, and that's that they're going to be flighty. They're probably not going to be very nippy and wanting to bite a whole lot, but they're going to be, whipping around in your hands, and but they'll figure it out very quickly. That if you're cool with your snake and you're providing a safe environment for them while you're handling them, then they're going to chill out pretty quickly. So I think on the scale of things, yellowtails and probably Texans can be a little bit more likely to defend themselves when they get scared. But there's not a huge gap. There's certainly a lot that are super chill. Those are also the two that will tend to musk me a little bit more than some of the others, which isn't fun with Drymarchon. It doesn't happen very often, but and obviously there's variability within individuals.
Yeah,
I have some that are just not cool snakes at all.
Even the Texas indigos believe in the Second Amendment, defending themselves.
That's right. They'll use what they can, but anyway, that's sort of handling and temperament. The major element to think about when you're talking about behavior with the Drymarchon genus, I don't care what it is, yellowtail, eastern, blacktail, whatever it is that they have a feeding response. Particularly when they get really comfortable with you in captivity and they're comfortable in the surroundings. Not all of them, but the majority of my snakes, they just want to eat all the time. Doesn't matter how full they are, morning, noon, or night, doesn't matter. And that's their first thought. So when you open their enclosure, you put your hand in, there's a good chance you're going to get bit, in a lot of cases. And so they're very visually oriented and they're just thinking about food all the time, and that's their deal, which is true of a lot of snakes. But what I notice as the difference between Drymarchon and a lot of other snakes, similar to what I was saying a moment earlier, is that they figure it out pretty quickly. As soon as they realize they're not being fed, they chill out. I've had, what did I have? I had some Taiwan beauty snakes that just never, ever stopped. And it wasn't them being mean or defensive. They were just constantly trying to chew on my arm. And it was like, dude, you're not being fed. Why are you trying to eat my arm? But they do it anyway. Rosy boas are super docile in a lot of ways, but you get super captive ones that get complacent. Anything that feels fleshy, they bite it.
Womas,
snakes can do that too, whatever else. But indigos, they really don't do that. Once they get over that initial, something's in my enclosure, I'm going to eat it, they stop.
Sounds a lot like a retic. And this is a good time to put in our plug, AE Stoney. If you guys need hooks or equipment, go to aestoney.com.
I have one myself.
Yeah, they're phenomenal. And I've talked to Stoney quite a bit over the last few months since he became a sponsor, and I really stand behind his approach to. He's always growing and adapting and changing the way he's making things.
So I don't know if you guys do the same thing with retics that I do with my indigos, but I'll use a cage hook.
Yeah.
And the first thing that's going to go into the cage is going to be a hook, and as soon as I get a coil into my hand, they stop. They just stop, and they're not going to try to eat me anymore. And from there, maybe I have an individual that's a little bit more high strung and is going to try to be defensive, but for the most part, that feeding response stops right away. So
as soon as you lift them into your hand a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I've made the mistake before. I had an Eastern Indigo where I opened the enclosure and I put my face in to look to see if it had eaten.
Oh no!
Last mistake. Last time I'll ever do that. But I mean, it hit me on the nose and just ripped my nose to shreds, and I was bleeding everywhere. And I'm yelling to my wife to bring the camera because I wanted photos of it. And that was one of my call mistakes. He was just hungry.
Yeah, retics are about the same way. Once you use that hook and you tap their head and just, you use that hook to kind of bring the body towards your hand and you grab them, they're good. I would say probably the only exception to that besides, each individual retic is different, but I would say that usually my females that are starting to build follicles and like their hunger is heightened dramatically. That's the one time where sometimes that food response turn offs for a second, but then kind of clicks back on again. And so during breeding season, I'll typically, rather than just tapping them with the hook and then grabbing them is when I'll tend to, hook them out a bit just so that I can see them moving away from me consistently.
Right.
I always say I wait until the rodeo stops when they stop bucking their entire body, start moving away. Yeah.
But yeah, interesting the similarities with that both species. Yeah, I mean, and that's something you talk about their food response, and I think that's something that all retic keepers can absolutely resonate in, and the similarity seems there.
Yeah, for sure.
Now, in terms of like enclosures with all the species, are the enclosure requirements pretty similar, or is there some species that do better in larger caging than others?
I keep them all the same. The size-wise, they're all pretty similar. I think, when you talk about, record lengths and so forth, I think the yellowtails have been recorded to be the longest. And maybe they're a little bit more trim and less bulky on average, but the differences are really pretty slight. In general, they're pretty well all the same size, all six. There are some localities that are a little smaller than others. The red Mexican indigos tend to be smaller on average than the others, but for the most part, you're pretty similar. With the Drymarchon genus, males get larger than females. A lot of snakes, I know it's the opposite, but on average, they'll generally end up being about a foot longer than females. Most males, although they can get over 8 feet, that's not super common. Most males are going to be in that sort of 7 to 7.5 foot arena, and females will be more like 6.5 to 7 foot arena, something like that. So as far as caging and all that goes, I haven't really noticed one species needing to be kept differently than another.
And when people are buying animals from you, take us through just kind of like a, hatchling or when you sell them, the size generally in the enclosure you recommend they put them in. And then what are you recommending at like their just different stages of sizes, I guess, if you could kind of, for those that are maybe interested and want to get a better idea of just the size of the enclosure that they would need.
Well, what I generally recommend for people, particularly if you don't have experience with the genus, is to start simple. This is something that I learned reading the old Caulfield books and stuff, is that start simple. And when you're talking about indigos, particularly young ones, they're more high strung. And if there's one thing that can really suppress a feeding response, it's going to be that they're scared or stressed. And so you don't want that. And so what I generally recommend, even if a snake is really doing well at my house, when it goes to your house, it may not because it's different and it's new. And these snakes think about things like that, whereas others may not. And so what I sometimes see with my buyers is that, a snake that'll be a super solid feeder will go to their house and they don't want to eat as much. And sometimes that's improper husbandry, bad temperatures, whatever it is. But sometimes it's just that they're stressed out. And so I like to keep them in small, simple, opaque enclosures where the visual stimulation is eliminated. I don't recommend them being kept in glass terrariums when they're young, particularly when you first get them to your house, because all that visual stimulation can freak them out and they won't want to eat. So what I generally recommend is, it's not exciting, but just go get a Tupperware tub, and just keep it in a tub for a while, for a couple months at your house, and let it build that comfort level at your house. And you don't need the whole big bioactive enclosure and whatever else when they're young. Um, and when you first get your snakes, set it up like that. Get the temperature solid, get everything perfect. Give it a good hide box so it can hide and feel safe and secure, but don't let it overstimulate itself with visual stimulation in a glass terrarium like that. And then what I tell my buyers is that there's a point in time, and I don't know if this transfers at all to the retic world, but there's a point in time where these snakes become confident and they become an alpha in their world. And when they're young, when you first open their enclosure, they run. But there's somewhere along the line, it might be 2 months down, it might be 6 months down, it might be a year down the line, whatever it may be for this individual. You open their cage and they look to see who's coming into their domain. And they look to see, am I getting fed or what's up? Because why are you in my space?
Right.
And when you start seeing that confidence level switch, you can keep them in any kind of setup you want. You can glass terrarium, or you can put them in a big bioactive thing with vines and whatever. You can do all that kind of stuff too. I just don't generally recommend that until you see that level of confidence. And it's a really neat thing to see, because you go from a snake that's scared of everything, and then all of a sudden something clicks in their head, and you go in their enclosure and they turn and they look at you, and they'll start coming towards you, and you can actually hear them huffing a little bit, breathing heavy when they're trying to check out what's going on. And it's a neat thing to see for juveniles to start doing that. And then, the adults will do it, and it's pretty cool. So behaviorally, it's a pretty neat thing to watch, but they're a lot easier to, take care of when they have that sort of personality development where they're pretty bulletproof at that point.
Awesome. Yeah. I love the way that they breathe and that huffing. You can hear it. And I know I visually, just watching videos, I know exactly what you're talking about, where they come out, they poke their head up, and it's very quick, and they're looking and studying, and just checking out what's going on. And it's and I'm sure, it doesn't get old for you, but that experience of seeing that switch go off and that confidence that starts to come up has got to be a pretty good feeling.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. It's pretty cool. When I'm debating if a snake is ready for a new home or not, a hatchling snake, I've gotten a feeding. I know when I see that behavior switch, then this snake is solid and well established and ready for a new home.
Awesome. And then I guess, like, what would you recommend as far as cage sizing of what someone would expect or need to expect to be able to house one of these adults?
Most people go with a 6x2 cage. I generally go a little smaller than that. I go more of a 4x2, which I think is the minimum of what you would want to do. Some of the big males can be cramped in a situation like that, but but somewhere in between a 4x2 and a 6x2 is generally where you want to live.
Okay. Awesome. And I as far as discussing husbandry, I think that it would be neglectful of us to not cover feeding. These animals are snake eaters from what I've looked into, and not only that, but I just love seeing people feed them just about anything and everything. I
was going to say they're trash cans from what I've
they're trash cans. But I'd like for you, if you can, going through the different prey items, but also talking about their their frequency. They digest so much quicker than pythons or boas, and just kind of talk about feeding in depth, if you don't mind.
Yeah, well, when you look at them in the wild and you read, gut content reports and things, they'll eat anything. I mean, literally anything they can fit in their mouth, they're going to eat it. And in the pet trade, we've sort of adopted this idea that snakes eat rats, snakes eat rodents, and when you look at what they're doing in the wild, that's not really what they're doing. I mean, they eat rodents, but it's a very small part of their diet. So it's what we have readily available in the pet trade, and I feed my snakes rodents too, along with other stuff. But they'll eat anything. And so in the wild, they're eating birds, they're eating fish, they're eating lizards, they're eating frogs, they're eating toads, and in a lot of cases, a lot of localities, they eat more snake than anything else. And so, how do we provide for that in the pet trade in a way that keeps your snake happy and healthy? And I'm a believer that a varied diet is gonna match a little better with what they're getting in the wild. And so the degree that we can provide that in the pet trade is going to make your snakes all the happier and healthier. So um, a typical meal for me, because they are so readily available and I have such a large scale of animals that I need to be able to buy a lot in bulk, is is a rodent and a chick. And that's a typical meal, for my adults. In general, indigos, and this is true for a lot of snake eating species, is that they don't have the same elasticity in their jaws, and so they can't handle the same size of a rat that another snake might. So a 7 foot indigo is not going to be able to handle the same kind of meal that a 7 foot retic is going to be able to handle.
Right.
And so even a 7 foot, 7.5 foot indigo, I'm feeding it a small to medium rat. Along with the chick, that's an average meal. And then to the degree to which you can throw in other stuff is good. Whether it's fish, if you're in the field a lot, I see a lot of DOR snakes dead on the road, and you can freeze them to kill off any parasites. And once you start feeding them other stuff, I mean, they've got a great feeding response no matter what you're throwing in front of them. But once you start throwing other stuff in there, you quickly get to see that they do have preferences, and there are things that we don't generally offer our snakes that they love, and are going to make them happy. So um, the metabolisms you mentioned is a thing. They digest their food a lot more quickly than other snakes, despite the cooler temperatures that you keep them at. So you feed them a meal, and they might be pooping 2 days later, and one meal might be three different poops across the span of 7 days.
Okay. And it's not just like solid most of the time. They'll
No,
paint their enclosure with it.
that's exactly right. And that the biggest knock that you hear about the Drymarchon genus is that exactly. And so there are things that I do to combat that. But you're right. It's a spray. You know, you want to picture like liquid cement, um, and they can put it on the walls. They can put it on the ceiling.
The ceiling.
So it's not a log like you Python guys are spoiled with. So and it can be nasty. It's pretty stinky. So one of the things that I do, and this is segueing over to back to kind of more husbandry stuff, is substrate. One of the things that I do is I use dry aspen shavings, but then I mix in compressed pine pellets that I buy from feed stores that people will use in horse stables and things to
Yep.
absorb urine, in horse stables, and so I mix that in small amounts in the aspen shavings, and when that liquid Drymarchon poop hits those pellets, the pellets expand and they absorb all that liquidy part, and it kills out the odor really effectively. So that's to me that was a lifesaver when I discovered that trick. I don't remember how many years ago we started doing that, but it's uh, it's absolutely essential if you're going to be keeping Drymarchon and if you're going to be keeping a lot of Drymarchon. Otherwise, you got to be cleaning a lot more often than what you're used to. And I've heard of guys that keep theirs on like newspaper. I don't know how you do that, man. You got to be cleaning and sanitizing every other day.
No, I can imagine, and I almost feel that, you know, once you get into a snake that you're cleaning I mean that's monitor realm as far as like how much you have to interact and feed and like
Yeah.
be involved in their life, right? Like, and not everybody, you know, there are some people that you know, like a lot of the chondro people, like that you know, you have a snake that perches and it poops on the floor and it's very easy and it's low maintenance and it's just there and you look at and it's beautiful, right? Um, and then you have some people that want to frequently interact with them, but one of the good things about snakes in general, right? You know, talking pythons, boas, and things like that, is that they're when you compare them to other pets in a home, they're super low maintenance.
Dogs, cats, yeah. I mean,
Right.
reptiles are generally pretty easy if you set them up right.
Right. But you know, you keep a python or a boa species for long term, and then you want to consider one of these animals. I can imagine it's a really big adjustment with the amount of cleaning that needs to happen.
That's right. It's busier for sure.
Yeah. Um, so let's see. We've talked about temperature, we've talked about feeding and cage size.
There's something I want to bring up.
Yeah.
In terms of just like their care. Is there any like beyond like the yellowtail cribos and the wild caught stuff? Are we seeing any common health concerns or issues with them?
No. I think the thing that we should probably talk about is with the Eastern indigo in particular, is that when there is no new blood coming in, rightfully so, um, but when the gene flow and the pet trade is completely restricted, then you start talking about inbreeding issues. And that's kind of more the health concern that people need to be mindful of, you know. Um, Other than that, I mean, if you're keeping your snake clean and your husbandry is good and your temperatures are right, there's not a whole lot to worry about. But when you're talking about breeding and
Hmm.
you're talking about which male do I breed with which female and whatever else, you know, you absolutely don't want to be doing the thing where you just buy two snakes and willy-nilly breed them, and you know, to try to get this more for that more for more red in this color because you're line breeding, so you're breeding a son to a mother or something. It's the kind of thing you don't really want to do in the Drymarchon world because in a lot of cases, particularly with the Eastern indigo, we start seeing some health problems arising with inbred snakes. So that's the bigger concern.
I know that one of the, at least what I've seen on groups that I'm in, is probably the largest or the most common health concern, that enlarged heart.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Um,
Now,
Yeah. So in general, the two kind of you know, genetic health issues that can arise is number one, dwarfism, and number two, enlarged hearts. And so dwarfism is where, you know, they get to about 4 feet and then they stop getting longer and they just start getting fatter.
hmm.
And that's generally more of an inbreeding issue. And then the enlarged heart thing. The enlarged heart thing can be tricky because it's not apparent when they're young, and they will generally start developing, 1, 2, 3 years of age, and then they get the enlarged heart, and you got a problem. But uh, that all really comes down to breeders just being responsible about what snakes they're pairing together and making sure that they're as unrelated as possible. And if there are snakes that have these sort of issues, they should not be bred, you know.
Right.
absolutely. And now with it sounds like, you know, with the conservation status, the Easterns are obviously the most bottlenecked. Are we experiencing this issue in the captive breeding within the U.S. with all the subspecies, or is it mostly just the Easterns?
It's Easterns is the most. I would say blacktails is probably second. There have been some inbreeding issues going on with blacktails, but I think that's hopefully lessening. I referenced it earlier, but in the last 5 or 10 years, there's been a lot more imported animals coming out of Central America, which I think has helped out. I know I've made an effort, particularly to start, trying to mix wild caught blood into my, longer term captive lines, and that's only going to help. So, um, yeah, it's definitely something to be cognizant of. It happens probably the least in yellowtails, but again, it's just sort of how responsible are breeders when they're pairing animals together? And a lot of people,
Right.
unfortunately, are still
True.
just like, hey, here's a male and a female, let's put them together. And, they were
It's that time
probably,
of the year.
in some
Yeah.
cases, they're siblings, and they bought a pair off of a guy at a reptile show. They brought a brother and a sister and they raise them up and breed them. So that's definitely something that's, I feel like, isn't as talked about or as important with other species of reptile, but it's a big deal in the Drymarchon world.
Yeah, I think there are species that are more prone to
Yeah.
inbreeding issues than others. And Drymarchon happens to be, you see that in large heart that's happening. And I'm just going off of like what I know about human development, anatomy, and health. So, you know, when if you're an individual that has a predisposition for cardiac issues, and you marry someone who has a massive predisposition for cardiac issues, you end up creating offspring, kids that are going to be predisposed, right? And so I when you say responsible breeding, I think that I don't know how far it is for the Eastern indigos, but I feel like if breeders, and I say this generally about all species, right? But the moment that you start to see signs and that comes up, if you don't do that pairing anymore, right, and you focus on long-term animals without those issues being taken to as far distant, related animals without that issues, you can revert. I feel that it can be not eliminated, but reversed a drastic amount if people are just mindful and observant and not just kind of turnkey profit mindset, I guess. I don't. What are your thoughts on that?
I agree, and it's just conversations that just need to continue happening,
Right.
And in the Drymarchon world, there were, even 10, 15, 20 years ago, there were people were starting to talk about that, and they were talking about, hey, you shouldn't be line breeding. There were people that were, rightly so or not, were accused of trying to produce animals that were more red by taking the two reddest siblings and breeding them together and line breeding, like people do all the time in the reptile world, but those conversations have been going on for a while in the Drymarchon world, and they need to continue going on. And as we kind of start becoming more technologically advanced, we're working on, actually being able to figure this stuff out. For a long time, I have a spreadsheet on my computer where I have data on every male that I've ever paired with every female and what the fertility rates were, and I have notes on, what I thought of the babies. And ultimately, I could care less about color. I don't care if it's bright red or not. What I want is a big, strong, robust baby.
Right.
And so I kept that kind of data. And if there were snakes that weren't um, producing fertile clutches regularly, I'd move on from them. Either use them in a different capacity or sell them off as a pet or something. And if there were babies that were weak, small, birth defects, whatever it may be, kinks, I'd move on from those adult breeders. And so over the course of 10, 15 years, I kind of honed it all down to just having like, these are my core group of breeders that I know are going to give me good snakes. And then eventually there was a DNA test that someone had developed, that where you could kind of get a little bit of a snapshot of how related snakes are and how inbred they were. And so I, eventually had all my animals tested with that, and lo and behold, it turned out that I was right, and that what I'd been doing over the years, did end up having good results in that regard. We're working now with a lab to develop a test that's even more comprehensive, so we can get a lot bigger picture of the genetic snapshot of these snakes to be able to kind of look at to say, hey, this is one that we maybe shouldn't breed, or maybe this one's predisposed to that, and well, I don't want to breed it to this snake. Let's breed it to this other one, and so we can actually start getting some real data with that, other than just observations. But there are conversations that need to continue to happen, in the Drymarchon world, and the more we talk about it, the more people hear about it. Like you've heard about it already, despite not having kept one, and you know more information is always a good thing, and more collaboration is always a good thing. So
Yeah.
we got to keep that up.
Yeah, and I appreciate hearing the effort that you're doing and willing to do these type of tests because, you know, like I said, it's species specific that you know, some of the bottlenecking effects happen much sooner than others, and you know, we're at the point now where I'd still love in 50 years if we're able to still produce healthy Eastern indigos, right? But if we're not talking about this, it's not going to happen. So I do genuinely appreciate that, and I do have one more as we were talking about like these health concerns and issues. Something else that just came along with the research and talking to people that have them. That I want you to speak on a little bit more, but it seems like Drymarchon are sensitive to moist substrate, and they can develop scale issues. And again, very ignorant on the topic. Just know that it can be an issue. Do you mind kind of elaborating on that?
Sure, and I, you know, humidity issues. It's also like we were talking about, you know, temperatures earlier with ambient temperatures in your room. You know, I live in Southern California. It's super dry here, you know, and I'm sure Salt Lake City's the same way. And I don't know what San Antonio's like, but it's really too dry for them here. So you want to be able to boost their humidity. But I think, you know, we've learned as a reptile community in general, there aren't many snakes that do well or reptiles that do well with wet. And there's a difference between wet and humid.
Mm-hmm.
And if we can provide humidity without providing things being wet as far as the substrate goes, I think we're learning that that's where the space we want to be in. Now, for me in Southern California, when I'm keeping tropical stuff, I'm still of the mindset that I like to keep my cage dry. So I like my substrate to be dry aspen shavings, and we talked about those compressed pine pellets. That really dries things out too. But my snakes do have humidity requirements, and Southern California doesn't give them that. So I provide all my snakes with humid hide boxes, and so it's just a large shirt box tub with a hole cut in the top, and I fill it with damp moss, and that's wet, you know. But they can go in and out of it as they choose, and it's the same idea of a temperature gradient, you know, that you kind of have a humidity gradient, and when they're in the blue and they need to shed, they'll go in there, and they can come in and out of it as they want. And I've never had a scale issue with that. I think when you start having the scale issues is when you've got all the substrate in your enclosure is all wet, high humidity holding substrate. And when you do that, you start having problems. So
is it more of like a blistering or?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Just little bacterial infections under the skin and whatever
right.
else, particularly when they're getting ready to shed, you know, the old layer of skin and the new layer of skin can get some bacteria in between it and all that. So
yeah, I think that it's important to note, especially, you know, when you're keeping something in ambient and or, you know, even if you do have a hotspot, but wet environments are a host of bacteria, and it just it creates mold, it creates just a lot of ugly things. And you know, even me keeping you know, chondros recently new for less than a year still, you know, you know, you get spray happy at first, because you want to keep them. And then I started noticing that one of my juveniles, started, the skin started having like a discoloring type of color. And, you know, I went back and told the breeder, sent the pictures, and they're like, yeah, you're just spraying too much. Just like spray twice a week. You know, and I keep my garage, I have a humidifier, dehumidifier that they counteract and balance. And so my garage is 60-70% humidity all the time. So I'm even realizing now, like, I don't even need to spray them. There's really no need to, because they have fresh water all the time, and they have air humidity is what they need. So yeah,
I think an important lesson with the humid hide boxes, especially for me, is like, it's just like heat. These animals will regulate themselves a little bit better than you trying to manually manipulate their environment.
Right, exactly. And especially species like Retics and Drymarchon that are smart, you know, or intelligent. Their ability to know what they need is they have it. The only time that, you know, Retics are stupid is when it comes to feeding. So, and I'm sure that Drymarchon have that kind of characteristic as well, as they'll come out mouth open and you know, eat a paper towel if you let them.
That's right.
All right. Nate, any other husbandry questions you have before we kind of get into breeding?
None that are popping up right now. I think we should just jump in.
Okay. We could kind of just like step by step kind of walk through and everything. I'm kind of just, I'm interested in you just kind of taking us through captive reproduction of these animals when it comes from cycling to pairings to how you're cycling. Is it temperature or food or and just some of the things that you have kind of a lot of people get into animals and want to breed them, and so just give us your a good rundown on what's made you successful and kind of the Drymarchon guy.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. Well, I think the first thing to get is that my way is not the only way. There are people that have success and they do things differently than me. So I can tell you what works for me and what has worked for me, but it's by no means gospel. But that being said, in contrast to a lot of other colubrids, a lot of colubrids are spring breeders. In the wild, snakes are, your bull snake or whatever else is going to be hibernating all winter, and then it warms up in the spring, and then they come out to breed and all that, and it's happy. And so we try to duplicate that, in the pet trade. So you're putting things down to hibernate and brumate, and then warming them up, and then pairing them after that. That's not the way that indigos do it. They're winter breeders, and this lines up with what we see in the wild. Their most active time in breeding in the wild, when you're looking at Texas indigos in Texas or eastern indigos in Florida or Georgia, is that the males are out cruising for females in November.
That's
So
awesome.
when it starts getting cold, that's when it happens, and they'll breed throughout the winter. And so they breed when it's colder, not necessarily when it starts warming up in the spring. So I'm not pairing my animals in March and April. I'm pairing my animals in November and December. And as far as cycling them, there's not a ton that I do. There are some differences that I'll get into, but there's not a ton that I do. I have a big window in my snake room. They get a natural photo cycle of that. The days are getting shorter in the winter. They pick up on that. I let the nighttime temperatures drop more, whereas most of the year, my high temperatures are 78, 80. You know, I might still continue that, but it might only be for a couple hours a day, and I might let the nighttime temperatures drop down into the upper 60s or something like that.
Oh, nice.
It's not super necessary, but you can do it. A little bit of a night drop. In a lot of cases, the light cycle just does it, and whatever the seasons are doing here in Southern California, they pick up on that, and so they're breeding in the winter. So I have noticed that with Eastern indigos, it is better to get them a little colder than the rest. Your fertility rates will be better. So there was a year where, I mean, I've tried a lot of different things with some varying amounts of success, but there was a year where I took their enclosures and I put them on my back patio. And yeah, and I just kind of let them do whatever it was doing, and I still had a thermostat on there and all that, but I dropped the ambient way down, and I might have still kept the heat on, in the low 70s or something. But I would have Eastern indigos that were locked up, actively breeding in 50-degree weather.
That's insane.
Wow. All right.
And they'd be just sitting there locked up for 24 hours in a row, and it was clearly this was their time. They're cycling now, and so you generally pair them when it is colder. Now, I don't do my Cribos like that necessarily. That's more, mid upper 60s, even into the 70s, though it's not a problem. So
Yeah, I don't think it's
that's the
getting
first thing
50
to notice.
degrees in
It's a
Central
winter and not a
America.
spring. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. But it's a winter thing and it's not a spring thing. So that's the start of it. But that being said, as we discussed before, they will eat other snakes, right? So that is something that you watch for. And so there are times when I'll sometimes get the snakes aren't ready. I think they're ready, but they're not ready. And you put them in and they're thinking still about food and not about breeding. And so I have had attempted predations. happening. So it is something that I need to observe. And there are certain individuals that I have that are more prone to that than others, that I know that I need to watch more. There's some of my animals I trust, others I don't. And so you have to make sure you keep the timing right. And that goes back to what we were talking about earlier. It's like, who are we to think that we know better than the snakes on what they need?
Yeah.
And sometimes they're cycling and sometimes they're not. So it's figuring all that out. The other element to it when you're pairing the snakes is that sometimes it's not a predation issue, but there's a breeding aggression issue that can happen sometimes. And you see this with a lot of colubrid snakes. I don't know if this happens in the python world, but it's not uncommon for a male to bite a female, right?
Yeah.
Behind the neck or something else. And it's generally innocuous and it's part of their courtship behavior or whatever you want to call it. But indigos are different because they have such strong jaws and such sharp teeth. And even though they have these big plate scales, compared to other snakes, the skin in between the scales and the interspacing is actually pretty thin. And you can get some pretty gnarly lacerations happening with an over aggressive breeder male biting the neck of a female. And so I've had them cut open, and we'll have to suture them up. And so that's something to watch out for too. I don't want to like cause people to panic about this because it's not the norm. The norm is generally a lot easier going, but it does happen here and then. So it is something that we have to watch out for.
Yeah, and
as far as all that goes.
I find it fascinating. What it talked about me wanting to get into Pitayas carnata. They're the same way. They are snake eaters, and there's some breeding aggression. It seems like it's a colubrid thing, a large colubrid thing at least. It makes it more, for someone new, right? Like anxiety provoking and kind of nerve wracking, but it's a whole different observation experience. It's really cool to see. It's like watching National Geographic and you see the rattlesnake behaviors and the breeding and all that kind of stuff. And you getting to experience that in person. And males being larger and heavier bodied, I'm sure they can do some damage, but I know that Nathan could probably speak on this as well with retics. I don't think we see the breeding aggression with a female who's receptive. What we do see in retics a lot is when a female is not ready, and if someone is not aware of the behaviors that females will engage in, they'll push their cloaca out, they'll pee, they'll poop, they'll buck, and I mean buck like they'll if you don't have a tall enclosure, some people back in the day kept the retics in 12-foot tall enclosures. You can literally hear them slam the ceiling of the enclosure. So that's really when it gets violent with retics, is when a female's not ready. Especially in the retic breeding world, females are generally much bigger than males. They will mess a male up if you're not, and then males have that bite.
It'll spook them, and then that's when they start going after each other.
Yeah, and male retics like to bite and then turn. And so I'm sure you've probably seen pictures online of people just being lacerated by male retics, and those are typically one of two things, like the bite and pull back, or it's a male breeding behavior bite and they're turning on you.
Yeah, it's a similar thing with Drymarchon when that happens. If you have a male that wants it, but a female who's not receptive, she'll run and he'll chase her. And invariably, again, it depends on the individual, but he may be biting her to stop her and to hold her still. And it could be mid-body, it could be tail, but he's just going to be grabbing at whatever he can grab at. And those are obviously the behaviors that you learn to look for when you're pairing. To avoid any issues like that.
Used to see the ducks in my backyard growing up do that. The males would destroy the female's neck area.
Right.
So they're pretty ravenous feeders. Is there any change in feeding during breeding season? Like during the winter months, are you feeding less? Are you or is there an increase of food as you're preparing to do pairings?
These are all just sort of averages. It's not really true across the board necessarily, but males will sometimes lose a bit of an appetite during breeding season because they're thinking about something else. Females will often want to eat more when they're cycling. But that being said, they are breeding when it's colder, right? So in general, breeding season, I'm feeding way less because it is colder. They can't handle the same meal sizes and whatever else. So I'm feeding generally smaller meals that are a little less frequent. Some individuals just don't want to eat at all in the breeding season, and that's not terrible. And but in general, most of my snakes eat throughout the winter, just maybe a little smaller meals, a little less frequent.
Okay. Awesome. And let's talk about, they're kept at cooler temperatures. So let's talk about, incubation temps and substrate, medium, and just that process. Like, what's the lowest that you typically would recommend incubating? Is that 70, 75, or is it pretty just consistent at a certain temp? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's definitely an important thing to talk about with Drymarchon because I feel like it is kind of when you compare it to other breeding other reptiles and incubating other reptile eggs, it is kind of an anomaly. Um, I mean, when I started out breeding Honduran milks and kings and gopher snakes, whatever, it was 82 degrees. Most colubrids are kind of in that area. That's too hot for the Drymarchon genus for the most part. They, for whatever reason, I don't understand it, but for whatever reason, you incubate the eggs cooler. And if you start getting into the 80s, you start getting babies with kinks, you start getting stillborn babies and whatever else, and birth defects and so forth. So I incubate mine at 76 degrees exactly. I have everything in an incubator. I got it all totally dialed in, and 76 degrees is where they stay. And I've had a lot of success with that. The other element to think about with indigo eggs is, in just my own observations, they seem to want to breathe more than other snake eggs that I've worked with in the past.
They're pretty tough too, aren't they?
Yeah, well, that's the other thing too, is that indigo eggs have a different texture to them. They're granulated, so they're rough across the top of it, whereas most snake eggs are, have that smooth, leathery feel. Indigo eggs are rough and granulated, and you got to think, well, that's got to hurt coming out. But if you're there catching the eggs as she's laying them, they're actually, it's kind of an interesting process. And I think most people, even indigo breeders, miss it because you got to be right there on the spot. But if you're catching them as they're coming out, they're sort of, when they first come out of the cloaca, they're sort of soft and gelatinous, and they don't have that kind of hard shape, and they don't have that granulated texture. But literally within 5 minutes or less, they firm up and dry out really quickly. It's pretty bizarre to observe. And then you kind of get that granulated feeling, and then they're dry and they've expanded and they filled out. Now they have their shape and they're not just a blob, but they're kind of, when they're first come out, they're kind of like little gooey blobs, and then they firm up. But anyhow, I bring it up with respect to incubation because I've learned over the years that you got to have airflow. And when people incubate eggs, they think a little bit too much about humidity and a little bit not so much about airflow and ventilation. And I found that if I have vermiculite's what I use. I've used perlite too with success. But if I have, the vermiculite stacked all the way up to nearly the lid of my egg box, and there's not a lot of air in there, the eggs don't do well, and they'll come out with defects or they won't hatch at all. So I started using taller egg boxes in really only a small layer of vermiculite down at the bottom that the eggs sit on, just to allow that kind of air. And I'm generally of the philosophy that, circling back to the ambient conversations that we've had, is keep the ambient humidity levels high in your incubator, but then have holes in your egg boxes inside the incubator so the air can flow through there. And I think that's really important for indigo snakes, maybe more so than other species.
Does that prevent condensation on the top of the lids? How much condensation are you getting?
I still get some, but yeah. again, it goes back to, you don't want wet, you want humid.
Right.
So I will also, I mean, when I was first learning to breed snakes, my mentors would tell me, get vermiculite, soak it in water, and then grab up handfuls of vermiculite, wring it out as much as you can. And when you got every last drop out of it, that's what you use for your eggs. I never measured, ratios of water to vermiculite. And that's what I use for, milk snakes and corn snakes and king snakes, and it works great. That's way too wet for Drymarchon. They're not into that. So I'll moisten the vermiculite, not nearly as wet as what I just described. And people ask me, what ratio do you use? To be honest, it's not super scientific. It's more of a feel thing.
Yeah.
I just sort of feel it. And if it's just kind of barely wet, that's what I want. And then I still put another 2 inches of completely dry vermiculite on top of that. And then I rest the eggs on that, because you don't want your eggs sitting on wet substrate. I've learned that can be a place where, then you're starting to get risks of mold developing and whatever else. So that's generally my go-to, that I'll have vermiculite that's drier than you would do other colubrids. And then I'll put a layer of completely dry on top of that, rest the eggs on top of that, with still a lot of height in the egg box left for a lot of air to be in the container, with holes poked on the side so we can get airflow going through. 76 degrees, that's the way to go.
Now we talked a little bit about the hatchlings needing, some special care requirements in terms of, just making sure they can't see out of the enclosure, making sure they get that confidence level up at first. But what other considerations do you have with the hatchlings?
Nathan, real quick, before we jump into that, I wanted to bring up, because it's something that I find fascinating, and I don't know the number, but I feel like indigo eggs or Drymarchon eggs like almost teeter on the length of incubation that monitor eggs are. I think of like retic eggs, 85 to 90 days, maybe for some earlier, 80 to 90, whatever. It's still a long time for snake eggs, but Drymarchon exceed that. What's the average hatch date that you're experiencing?
It's longer. You're right. It's longer. It's almost never happens that I get a clutch that's less than 90 days. It's pretty infrequent that I get a clutch that's less than 100 days. I would say average is somewhere around 105 to 115, somewhere in there. I've had clutches go over 130, 140 days, and I'm
not patient enough for that.
I'm telling you guys, I have spreadsheets of every year that I've bred, and I keep all track of all this data, and I cannot put rhyme or reason to it. There are sometimes they just take 20 days longer, and sometimes they take 20 days shorter. And I cannot for the life of me figure it out. But it, and again, like I said, I incubate everything the same, and some of them are 95 days, and some of them are 115, and some of them are 125, and it's just the way it is. I don't know what to say. Side comment, not to derail it too much, but on that subject, for the first time this year, just thought I'd share. I haven't shared this with anybody yet, because I'm just now starting to look at it. But I started writing down the dates that I saw visual lockups, visual copulation, to keep track of gestation. And then I started counting the days between a visual lockup and the actual laying of the clutches. And man, there's no pattern that I figured out yet. I need more years of data to get this going, but some of them were 90 days and some of them are 140 days. And between copulation and actual laying of the eggs, I haven't seen any commonalities between certain subspecies being more consistent along that line than others. But anyway, just a little side comment of something that I've been kind of poking around at.
I like that because, in the retic world, the way that we count down, you typically expect on like day 35-ish, right? So like 32 to maybe 38. From the time of like the prelay shed. So they'll shed, and then there's about 35 days that you typically will set on your calendar, and that's when you expect to lay. But now that I've talked a lot to chondro breeders and to other python breeders, and listening to an episode on NPR, I'm learning that the most accurate way, at least for pythons, is the number of days from ovulation, because that shed after ovulation fluctuates so much. Because you'll have people that in the Retic world that their animals will lay on day 45, and then some that lay on day 28. And it seems like, based off of other python breeders, that when you observe the ovulation, the number is a lot more dialed in from ovulation to egg deposition.
Now, forgive me for being a colubrid guy here. How do you observe ovulation?
So you know, after copulation, you're locking and everything, you know, you typically will see like a disinterest in the male, and, you know, a little bit after that disinterest, what you're looking for is a massive swelling. It basically looks like
swelling.
Pretty obvious.
Yeah, so you'll have follicular swelling at the beginning that they start to get bigger, and that's when you know that they're building follicles. Then ovulation is actually not even the right term. I forget what the right term is, but that's what a lot of people will just say that it is. You notice an ovulation swelling, and basically on their lower third of the body, it looks like they ate a meal they shouldn't have eaten. That
start looking gravid, but is there like, because you're talking about counting days from that point, is there like a day where you're like, okay, it just happened?
Yeah, it's just the day of like the massive big swelling that you see.
Yeah, we don't generally see that. I mean, there are definitely snakes that like, hey, this snake is gravid, you know, but I don't want to say that it's that noticeable to say, 'cause sometimes, you know, it's hard to see at all. But you're right about the prelay sheds. I think in a lot of colubrids that I've dealt with, it's more like a week, 10 days. In Drymarchon, it's more like 3 or 4 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
In there from the time that they have their prelay shed to when to expect eggs.
Yeah. All right. So done with that breeding aspect. Nathan was getting into a really good topic as far as setting up and the care for, you know, fresh hatchlings and all that good stuff.
Well, so the struggle is you know, exactly what we've talked about when we're talking about feeding. In the wild, they eat everything. And so the hard thing with baby Drymarchon is that they don't always want rodents. They don't always want what you're trying to give them, and that's the problem, right? So and it's a little trickier, at least in my experience, you know, than say a gray banded king or something, where, you know, if it doesn't want a mouse, it probably wants a lizard. You know, with Cribos and Indigos, it can be tough because if they don't want a mouse, maybe they want a fish. Or maybe this one doesn't want a fish, it wants a lizard, or it wants a snake, or it wants a bird. You know, so you're having to use all of these scenting techniques that a lot of us have used, but you have to do it with multiple prey items, and there's a trial and error aspect to it that can be really frustrating. So, you know, when you get the baby snakes to hatch, just to take you from the beginning through, I generally don't mess with them at all until they have their first shed. And once they get their first shed, I'll start the feeding trials. And so my general way to do it is I like starting with a live pink. So I'll throw a live pink in there, and if they don't take that, then I'll come through and I'll scent it with something. And no matter how many snakes I produce, I got feeding cards for everything. And what did I try, what worked and what didn't work. And maybe one snake wants it scented with fish, and the other one, you know, turns its nose up at fish, but it wants, you know, feathers from a chick to be sprinkled over the pinky. And maybe that's going to work. So, you know, the biggest challenge with baby Drymarchon, and there are some differences in the subspecies on this, but the biggest challenge is getting them established on rodents. And, you know, like I said, it's sort of the expected norm here in the reptile world that when you buy a baby snake, the expectation is that it's feeding on rodents, right? And whereas that may not be what that baby snake really wants, but as a breeder,
or even should be eating, right? Like, I mean, you really shouldn't be feeding them solely rodents. At least in my opinion, I think that's what leads to obesity in a lot of those species.
That's right. But that's sort of the norm in the industry that we have, right? So a lot of my work which is just getting started now. I've got all my eggs are hatching right now. Is the feeding trials and getting things ready for new homes, and that might take me a month. It might take me 6 months, depending on the individual snake and in what it wants and how I can get it going. So that's really the biggest challenge with breeding Drymarchon is getting the babies going. Now, there are some differences though. I would say in general, Texas indigos are the easiest. For whatever reason, 80, 90% of them, they'll just crush rodents right out of the gate and you don't have a problem. If you do have to scent, it's maybe one or two times and then you're good to go.
Yeah.
And believe it or not, Eastern indigos can be difficult and it can take a while to get them started. But some of the Cribos, yeah, I mean, it can take a while. Generally, I'm using fish or chicks or quail, some kind of poultry, and that gets the majority of them going. But you might still be 8 months later and it won't eat a pinky. But if you put the tiniest little drop of fish scent on the nose, then they take it, aggressively right off the tongs. So it can be a little frustrating at times, but yeah, it's if you have aspirations of breeding indigos or cribos of any fashion, it's something that you need to be ready for. And it's something I had to get a crash course in pretty quickly because I had a clutch of black-tailed cribo eggs before I really had any idea what I was doing, and that learning curve was steep.
Yeah. I think Nathan and I are super lucky with retics for the most part. I'd say for the most part.
Yeah, for the most part.
They'll slam food pretty readily and maybe some tease feeding, but I don't know of any retic breeder that has to scent to get their retics eating. But yeah, there definitely are other species out there that it seems like the biggest pain of it all is the getting them established and I'm sure that speaks to price point for a lot of species. I can imagine a lot of people talk about indigos and being pricey and I mean their looks speak for it all. I mean that's all I need, right? But when you talk about potentially 120 days of incubating and then possibly 4 or 5 months of working hard to try to get an animal to eat that, you might have sweat dripping onto the snake because you're feeding a bunch of them. It's a lot of work that people don't realize. It's a lot of time that goes into it. I've always respected the market price for Eastern indigos and how it's been really solid for a very long time.
Well, you touched on a few points there. When you talk about market price of really anything, I don't care if it's a pet or not. For me, it's a function of supply and demand. Like anything else. And one of the, when you raise up points about how much work it is to get them going or to breed them or even to keep them in general. I mean, you're feeding these. My food bill is astronomical. I got to tell you.
I can imagine.
But that being said, listen, if I was selling them for $100 each, I just wouldn't do it.
Right.
Or I wouldn't do as many. I mean, I might have a pair or two that I would keep because they're cool and I enjoy it and I like it, but not to the scale that I do, So eventually that's going to affect the supply part in the trade. If you have animals that are cheap, but are a lot of work, I think you're just not going to see that many out there,
Yeah.
But these are worth it. I mean, they're worth it for me. And I'm not talking about worth it financially. I'm talking about worth it because they're cool. And because people do respect that the price point that they're at and the demand is high enough to own an animal like that, to be able to work with an animal that's cool, that is that cool. So, it's a space that I'm happy being in, it's fortunately I can sell them for a price that makes it worth my effort, but also that satisfies my own passion for these animals and being able to share it with other people too. So that's a good point that you make.
Yeah. And again, I mean, Nathan, I don't know if you're able to pull up on his website of any of the really just larger photos of the Eastern indigos, but Yeah, you just go to them being cool, and also the fact that the largest snake in the US, and again, I mean, they look like dragons. They look prehistoric. They have, they're New World colubrids, right? But they just look so, I don't know, the epitome of like a snake. And even the other Drymarchon species, they got that black eyeliner, right? And they have that look that is just so incredibly sharp. And yeah, they're
Well, you're not wrong, and you mentioned earlier in the episode about cobras, and I've had several buyers that have come to me that say, "Hey, look, I work with cobras in a zoo, but I can't own them, so I want an indigo or I want a cribo,
right.
because they're pretty similar. I've never. It's not legal for me to work with venomous where I am, but it's and visually too. You talk about that black eyeliner. Go look up forest cobras. I mean, that's a cribo.
Yeah, they
it's
look
it's
so much alike.
they're essentially non-venomous cobras that don't hood up. They're very similar in a lot of ways. And the other thing that we haven't touched on yet when we were talking about feeding that I really think is super cool is that most reptiles or most snakes anyway are either constrictors or there's a venom aspect to subduing their prey. Indigos are neither. They just grab and bite and crush and eat, and there's just
Alive or
something
dead.
alive or dead, and there's something sort of primordial about that. It is just, you talk about dragons, it's just super. They just grab it and eat it. I mean, they don't care.
And they slam it too. Like I've seen
That's right.
that.
That's right. And when you talk about a food response bite, or something. We talked about them, having an aggressive feeding response when you go in their cage. It's that they don't reach out and grab the prey and pull it into their coils like most snakes do. They drive through it. They drive right through their prey item and they try to pin it or crush it back against whatever's behind it. So yeah, I mean they're biting it, but there's a blunt force trauma element to it that is really cool to watch. I mean it's a different kind of animal for sure. And we can talk about it all day, but really until you kind of keep one and kind of observe and watch those behaviors, you don't really get it. I mean,
I'm sure it's
they're
cool to
different.
watch, not necessarily cool to receive. Especially not to the nose. Um,
That's right.
but I was gonna ask you, I was gonna ask you to kind of give your sales pitch on the animals, but you kind of did that right there. I wanted to wrap up. As we're getting close to the 2 hour mark, I wanted to wrap up. We with every guest that we have on, we generally have our Patreon ask some questions, and we pick a couple of the questions that are out there that they ask, and so I wanted to end with some of the Patreon questions that were asked.
No problem.
Um, all right. So, one of our Patreon members asked about the poop. Is it really as bad as people say? I think we talked about that earlier. It can be pretty bad. Is there anything else that you want to add? Is it as bad as what people really do
Uh,
say?
the short answer is yes,
Okay.
it is. But that
Nice.
being said, it is manageable,
Yeah.
particularly when you talk about those compressed pine pellets that I love using. So yeah, I mean it's different, and it is something that you need to be aware of before you make an investment like buying a Drymarchon. So you need to know what's coming, and you need to know how you're going to deal with it. You're either cleaning a lot more often or using the compressed pine pellets. But for me, it doesn't bother me. It's manageable with the way I do things. So, but everyone should be aware before they go down that road.
And they also asked, would a blacktail Cribo be an easier pet than a false water cobra? Now, that's assuming that you might know about false water cobras or not, but just
I've kept them a little bit. They're very similar, but the difference is that if you get chewed on by a false water cobra, it's different than being chewed on by a cribo.
yeah,
Because false water cobras are rear fanged, and you have that to sort of deal with, and you don't know how your body's going to react to that kind of venom. So they're similar in their food response. They're similar in their metabolism. They're similar in a lot of ways. But when you're talking about taking a bite from either one, I'll pick the blacktail every time.
yeah, yeah. Bias or not, I mean, I just like the blacktails more too, but
Yeah. Well, there's that.
All right. Let's see. Wow, I cannot read my screen with how dark it is. Sorry, Lucas.
You're good. You're good.
Let's see. What sets them apart from other impressively large and active colubrids?
Yeah, John asked that question. It's a good one.
Yeah, no, that's a good one. It's kind of one of those intangibles that it has to do with the way they watch you. It has to do with the way that you interact with them. It has to do with, like we talked about, how quickly they shut off their feeding response, how quickly they get to know what's going on around them, how where they are, their surroundings. A lot of visually active colubrids are just kind of really high strung and just kind of hyper all the time and all that sort of thing. But we toss around the word intelligence when we're talking about indigos a lot, and it's a difficult thing to quantify, because you're not giving them a math test or anything. But you see that they're thinking and they're figuring things out, and they're learning as they're observing and they're watching, which I don't feel like all colubrids do, and even the ones that are really visually oriented.
I think that's something that
it's hard to describe.
Retic keepers can definitely relate to that. So I think that's why you see a lot of retic keepers at some point being interested in Drymarchon.
Yeah. It's really hard to go to another species when you keep an intelligent one. Or one that's just very cued and honed in. I bet that, like, you see the studies with the mice doing like the mazes to get to like the food and everything. Like, if there's a snake out there to like do one of these mazes and stuff, a Drymarchon would be perfect. Like, I feel like they're the ones who are going to be able to go through a maze that they can't move and just bulldoze down, and be able to repeat it and figure it out.
I would absolutely love seeing someone try to do that. I did see, I don't remember who it was, but I did see somewhere someone do something similar where they hit a food item in like a little puzzle, and the indigo was nosing around trying to figure out where it was and all that. And it was really neat to observe that kind of behavior. Yeah, it's a tough thing to describe intelligence in a snake. It's just another level that I've never seen in anything else I've kept. So hard to describe, but that's what I think sets them apart.
Awesome. Yeah, it's still a bucket list dream species of mine that will definitely. I mean, I'm in my growing era right now. I'm in my experimental phase. I've been getting new species, and so I am excited to get into the larger colubrid realm, but a Texas and a Eastern indigo are definitely very high on my list. But John, man, I want to again thank you for coming on and hanging out with us for the last couple hours. Before we head out, do you mind sharing what's the best place people can reach out to you? Where can people look at the animals you have available, and any process or things that you want to share about how to reach you and how to go about inquiring about one of your animals?
It's interesting. I don't feel like an old guy, and I don't feel like I've been around forever. But you brought up earlier about my website. And when I was getting started, it was like, for me, it was like all about the website. And I feel like people look at websites less than they used to. I don't know if that's true. I mean, I'm not doing the TikTok thing or
it's
whatever
back.
else. I think at some point, like, the technology stuff surpassed me. But anyway, the best place to find me is on my website. It's blackpearlreptiles.com. You've been watching it throughout the show here. And I'm also on Instagram and on Facebook on Black Pearl Reptiles. You can find me there. And that is the limit of my knowledge on how to market myself through social media, Instagram, Facebook, and
I'm
my
right
website.
there. I'm right there with you. I tried giving TikTok a run. It's just way too much.
I am on YouTube. I do have a YouTube channel. I'm not very active with it, but you can find a lot of videos I've done over the years on there. I know a lot of people do their research on YouTube these days, but
yeah.
Anyhow,
even if you're not active, I'm sure those videos are invaluable.
Oh, I came across one not long ago, and I remember it said viewed, and I looked, and it probably watched it 4 years ago. Yeah. And then as far as reaching out to you for inquiring about animals, like, do you have any wait lists, or do you like what's that process like?
Yeah. So as we stand right now, I've got all 6 of the major subspecies that I'm producing this year. The demand for Eastern indigos is still prohibitively long for me to be able to keep up with the people that I already have on my waiting list. So as of now, that waiting list is still closed. I would hope to open it next year. Also along that line, we didn't talk about morphs at all, but there's an exanthic black-tailed Cribo, and I do produce those, but the waiting list is exhaustively long for that, so that's currently closed. But if you strike those two, everything else is available without a waiting list as of this year. I shut down my waiting list on everything for a while so I can just get caught up, and I'm now caught up, and so everything's available for reservation with the exception of the exanthic blacktails and the Eastern indigos.
Okay. I mean, to me, it sounds like a really good problem to have.
Wait problem. I've enjoyed very high demand for these for a long time, and rightfully so. They're neat snakes.
Yeah. All right, Nate, you got anything else?
No, I think that about wraps it up. Thank you, John, for spending your evening with us.
Right on, guys. That was a lot of fun. I really appreciate it.
All right, John, we're going to send you back and wrap up here. But again, thanks. And we'll definitely be talking more in the future.
You got it. All right. You know where to find me. Talk to you later, guys.
Take it easy.
See ya. All right, guys, episode 102 in the books. 103 is sure to be a fun one. But until then, make sure to follow us over on Instagram. If you want extra access to the Retic Lounge, find us on patreon.com/the Retic Lounge. You'll get access to the Discord over there, early access and meetings. Let's see. I think that's about it.
I just realized Lucas, it didn't have my main light on the whole time, but oh well. Again, shout out to our Patreon members. Thank you for sending those questions that you guys had. A lot of the other questions that were asked, we kind of covered throughout the whole thing. But again, if you guys want to join a good Discord community within our Patreon, it's only $5 a month. That link is down below. And yeah, that's all I have. We'll see you guys for 103 coming up soon.
All right. See you later.